How's everybody doing? So first off, just wanted to thank everybody here that took time out of their busy lives and work to come and hear people like me present. It's my first time presenting for GrafanaCon. It's my second GrafanaCon as an attendee as well. And I've kind of become used to GrafanaCon passing out these excellent scarves. Everybody get a scarf this morning? So the great thing about the scarves, you never have to worry about what to match it with. They just match. And it also, as someone who lives in Southern California, I'm starting to expect GrafanaCon to always be hosted somewhere cold. So I'm looking for maybe next year Siberia or somewhere. So I get a chance to use my scarf. So I wanted to bring a little bit of a story that we've been going through at Amgen, and we'll talk a little bit about what Amgen is for those of you that don't know. And we'll just kind of do a quick overview here. We'll talk a little bit about our company, some of the inherited technical debt that I had as a manager of a team there, a little bit about our environment complexity, incentives to change, a new hope and model that we were able to implement, and talk a little bit about what's next. So in getting it started, a little bit about Amgen. Amgen is one of the world's leading independent biotechnology companies. We're located and operating in over 100 countries, and we've reached millions of patients. So what is biotechnology? It can mean different things to different people, but think of it as the application of biology in the space of therapeutics. So traditional pharmaceutical companies apply chemistry and chemical compounds to find ways to deliver treatments. Amgen focuses on the living cells, the biologics. So we're actually located, we have one major manufacturing site an hour from here. Anybody from Breda, Netherlands? So we're located here. We're located around the world though. And just a quick look at some of the products that we offer that you may or may not have heard of. But these are all FDA approved and in the public space in various countries. Amgen's mission is really around delivering therapeutics that can restore health and help save lives. So let's dive into a little bit about inherited technical debt. So to give you a little background about myself, I've been a manager at Amgen for about 2.5 years, joined in June of 2015, and was coming from an e-commerce background where pretty much everything we did was built by ourselves, and we had a large development team in support of that. And Amgen is a traditional company from the sense that it was started in 1980 and very much focused on the life sciences aspect, not so much software development. Software development was something that was used at the advanced research levels, certain genome data, but it's not a software company. Revenue is not generated necessarily as a traditional software company would find itself. And the team that I inherited was a monitoring platforms team. So that team has multiple teams inside of it. We'll talk specifically today about what we did as far as offering tools as a service back to our clients, similar to, I think, the talk that was given earlier by Bloomberg, this idea that we're supporting thousands of applications across an organization that have their own support models, but they need to come to us for a shared service and shared platform. And there's always the concept of, when you inherit something as a tool, whether it was commercial or you built it yourself or it was a hybrid, this idea of the positives and negatives come up all the time when it comes to refreshing what those tool sets look like. So for us, let's dive in and talk a little about the commercial monitoring tool platforms in use. Anybody have a guess how many were there? 5? A little higher. Yeah. So we actually had 18. And so 18 commercial platforms that were in use at the time that I joined. So if you start to think about okay, what are you doing with 18 tools? Well, maybe it depends on how many applications you have, how many data centers do you have, what are you running, right? And what are those tools doing? So traditionally, monitoring tools kind of have what I call the catalog problem. Gartner's done a very good job of promoting this idea that tools can fall into APM space, NPM, network performance monitoring, infrastructure, or alerting. So this was the makeup of our 18 tools. And so we had 5 APM tools, 8 NPM tools, 4 infrastructure, and 1 alerting. And they all did different things, but when it was described to the business and to clients, it's this massive amount of tools that you have to decide how to work with. How are you going to instrument your application? What about your infrastructure? What does it look like? And in the incident process, how are you going to find all the data at the time that it's necessary to do so? So in looking at what we were monitoring, this is kind of an approximation here, but as far as infrastructure, which could mean anything from physical hosts to virtual to network devices to containers, the number is around 12,000. And we had about 3,000 applications that are across various business functions, corporate shared applications. We had operations applications, manufacturing applications. Amgen is an end-to-end biotechnology company, from the research and development process all the way through every stage to the FDA process and out to manufacturing to the delivery of the therapeutics. So those 3,000 applications are not all built in-house, but many of them are, and there's not a single person at Amgen over the last 38 years that knows about every single app. So that's kind of some of the challenges of why tools were acquired when businesses would bring in a new service, and it's like, well, what do we need to do to monitor this tool? We don't have an ability across these other 15 tools, so let's just bring in something else. And it gets piled in so that to the point where managing it becomes a little untenable. You have a heterogeneous environment where it's not okay just to have a single tool, but there was a lot of difficulty around financing it and getting new people that come on board to the company to understand why we did what we did, especially when it comes to like the usability of it, and we're trying to offer this as a service back to people. So some additional challenges, those 18 tools, just to kind of give you an estimate, they were 7 figures annually for the maintenance cost. There was a lack of agreed upon source of truth, so these tools lived in silos. They didn't really talk to each other. There was very little automation. The little automation that we were able to do out of some of these commercial tools is very much focused on just like deployment and really basic like IT operations. Lack of flexibility to change out the tools and innovate. We'll talk a little bit about when you're locked into certain kinds of contracts and certain kinds of dependencies in regulated environments where to make a change, you're going before people that are not technical because it's an FDA-regulated environment. It becomes a little bit of a challenge to just say, well, let's just throw in Prometheus or let's just throw in Grafana. Like, well, okay, now you have 20 tools. What are you going to do? Right? It's a terrible idea. Lack of API integration points for the tools themselves. That was something that we saw as a challenge. This was kind of a behavioral thing that I want to make sure you guys understand. Like, what I'm going to go into is we're going to get to some technical things, but I really want you to think about, like, if this is you and you are leaving whatever position you're in now, maybe you're in a position where you're thinking about these problems, but you join a large enterprise that has been in existence for a while. There's kind of this reliance in the past and probably still ongoing that with SaaS, it's a little bit different because it's maybe a little less visible on when they upgrade. But with traditional software vendors, you pretty much were at the mercy of when their next quarterly update was or what was their roadmap. And yeah, okay, you could give them a little extra money to try to get a roadmap in, but it's very difficult as a code base becomes really big over like 15 years or 20 years, depending on how old the software originally was. There was a lack of scalability. Scalability from an implementation perspective, we had, out of those 3,000 applications, the number and percentage that actually had full, nice visibility into their applications through a dashboard was marginal. It was less than 5%. There was a human aspect to that because most of the stuff was being built manually. So there were teams that would come through in an engagement and they'd try to, do a manual dashboard and get something nice for one team. Weeks later, then okay, now we have, a really big backlog. And another problem was that some of these tools were in place for greater than 10 years. So if you think back to 2008, what the monitoring landscape looked like, or even 2015 when I joined, to 2005, monitoring's changed a lot, right? I think we can all agree on that. And the biggest challenge I think that we had was really back to this tool fatigue, though. And the question became, when it comes to funding like a commercial tool or even funding an open source tool that has additional different types of costs, is like, why do we need yet another tool? And that's one of the challenges that I really spent a lot of time when I first joined Amgen and thinking about, because the previous company that I worked for is called Newegg.com. I don't know if you've ever shopped there, but we sell PC gaming things. And their focus on tools was really basic because it's an e-commerce app, and so you can really streamline things. Here we're talking about an environment with every technology you can imagine that you can purchase is probably in use at Amgen. So it's no longer a question of oh, can I just instrument it with one tool? But when you start describing tools at scale, the terminology of tools in the traditional Gartner sense doesn't really scale. So we'll get into some of that. And here are some of the technologies that were in place under those tool type platforms, APM, NPM, infrastructure. Some of these are probably old, familiar friends or frenemies or enemies of system engineers that have been around for a while. And basically, besides a lot of tears and sadness, it adds up to a lot of money and time. And in the end, it's licensing, it's teaching users how to use the tools, it's not being able to automate. So even if I want to go through and sit down and have sessions across the organization, across 100 countries where I have people using this data, it takes a long time to scale that out of a team of like 30 people, right? So talk a little bit more about some of the environment complexity within our own teams and within our services of what we did. I put this nice little key logo here that you'll see in the presentation. One of the key things we learned as we were starting to get ready to change is that processes will get built around what's available. So when you offer as a service back to a large organization, like an ability to do up-down monitoring or an ability to do APM, but only with this version of Java or this version of .NET, processes get built around that. And good or bad, you have to be aware of those when you're going in to make a change. So the delivery of monitoring as a service, when I joined, is kind of something like this. The tickets were made within our CMDB. Anybody familiar with CMDB? Idle people? Yeah, a little bit. So it's the idea of change management database where everything that you have in the company is supposed to be cataloged, itemed, and people were making ticket requests against pieces of infrastructure or code to say, we need to build or decommission the monitoring within the systems. Maintenance mode, everybody loves that, right? Especially when you have a system without high availability and there's only one server running the app, you gotta have maintenance mode, otherwise you get a bunch of alerts, right? Building dashboards was a manual task. Requests to monitor X, so like custom requests coming in. Requests to alert on Y. Requests to find the root cause of performance and reliability issues. So even though the application teams themselves had support teams, they would often come back to us because we're the monitoring team and we offer this platform. So for the really hard root cause analyses, you'd have to come to us and wait in line, basically, as we had a really long group of requests. And then we'd get a lot of requests to export data for reports. How's our cloud utilization? Amgen has a really big presence in AWS. How's our data center utilization look like? And all this came from monitoring data. So this is a little bit of an image of some of the technology, just a very small sliver, if you can see some of these. All the traditional things that you can imagine we have: SAP, NetApp, JBoss, ASP, Red Hat, Jenkins. New to old, it's all there. And this is our monitoring superwoman here, and she can fulfill most of the monitoring needs like metrics, logs, alerting, and dashboards, but it'll take 3 years to finish our backlog based on the current processes that we were doing. So it's a balancing act that we were having to go through, and I noticed the stress on the team right when I joined, right? Like I've got people that are coming to me like, hey, we can't do this, we need to hire more people, we need to get this and this. And it's very much focused on improving, getting to the goal of delivering this as a good service within the company, but without thought of like changing out the tools, because a change would be like, too expensive or too something, right? So after a monitoring engagement in a traditional sense, people would come away with a few things. They would get out all their logs put into Splunk. They'd get a little bit of a view of their infrastructure through a handmade dashboard that took time. They'd get some key URLs monitored. So like if they have an endpoint that's a web browser-based application, it would check for 200, which is the best way to check things, right? No. APM with App Dynamics or New Relic separately for a price, alerts and auto incidents with tickets. And the problem was that there was a lot of gotchas, a lot of buts. Like, you're also going to need to learn how to query and use Splunk because we don't have time to sit there and do all your queries for you. You had to, again, the view of the infrastructure was bad because it was handmade. The URLs being monitored, no content checks, no transaction tests. So I'm not even getting into the details that like I'm bringing into the organization of, people want to do some really nice things around customer experience. The W3C metrics mean nothing to people at this point, right? Because it's not even capable of like providing that back to the business at this point. The alerts are static. You don't get the context of other applications' performance, like how are you doing versus other people in the same data center or, dependent on the same services like storage. And it was you didn't get a single view of the entire stack end to end, whether that was, including the internet access that the service relied on, if it relied on a SaaS service like Okta, some kind of single sign-on. none of it was all in a single view. So when problems would arise, you would have, the traditional pass around the screen to show like, oh, here's what I'm seeing on my side, here's what the DBAs are seeing, and here's what the network team is seeing. All the traditional DevOps challenges that people have been trying to solve for a long time are there. The reality was that customer satisfaction after this was really just kind of like three states. The first is a little green face of, meh, it's okay. Then we had kind of the sigh, like, really wish I could do better. And then, of course, we had our tears of sadness. And that made me sad, and that made everybody sad, because we're paying 7 figures a year to do this, and I'm not even able to really make a lot of people happy. So we're talking an organization that has over 25,000 employees and an additional probably 15 to 20,000 contractor employees that are also involved with like consuming this data. Not a good thing. So what were some of the incentives to change? Well, before we get there, let's just talk a little bit about like changing in an organization that large. Change is hard. Bad changes are really hard too, just because you're actually implementing a different change. Like if I choose the wrong next monitoring tool, I'm going to be stuck with number 19, and it's just not going to like make anybody impressed. In fact, it's just going to increase my OpEx probably. Really bad changes are harder because it's harder to get out of them. The right change, I believe, can be the hardest when you're going into this, but inaction can be really deadly to an organization and your team. And I'm speaking of that from in terms of talent attraction and morale of existing team members, because they're the ones who get the feedback from the rest of the users, right? Like the actual users for us are internal to the company, but we operate as a global service. So in a sense, we're kind of like an internal vendor to our own company. So why is change hard? Because of a band of group that people like I call the disincentives. So that could be from your team, it could be from your budget, it could be from time, and it could be from a person I'll affectionately call a vendor guy. Very affectionate though. So the team, here's some things that you might hear when you're going to implement certain changes and things that we heard. How am I going to implement changes while I'm still doing my day job? That's a big waste of time and money that I could be spending on my backlog. I have all these other requests to do. It's been working for years. I don't think the new tool will match all the functionality, right? How many people are still missing that one SNMP collection point that was like 3 versions back, right? But when you start to compare things one-to-one, it becomes like a very tunnel vision of, it's really going to be hard to change. Budget, basically says to us, spend wisely and come back next year and be ready to tell us how you're going to spend your budget before you spend it, because if you don't, then you're not going to get the budget anyway. So if I don't know my solution to my problem and I'm trying to budget for that, I kind of have a problem, right? Time, you're under a 3-year maintenance contract that renews next year, better have your new change done, or else, right? Because then that means I'm gonna have to renew again, and now I've implemented a change that no one's using, and I still have to renew the old cost that I had. This is very common in commercial software tools where you maybe come out with like an extension of a contract to get support and maintenance, which enterprises traditionally like to use because they need to have someone to call, have someone to rely on for specific version updates, right? And then the vendor. Automation, you want APIs? Just upgrade when it comes out next year after you renew, which is a very common like carrot stick approach to like traditional software vendors within the monitoring space. And it's just kind of like a disincentive. Like it's a lot of things coming at you, and I'm getting asked by my superiors like, so what are you going to do? How are you going to finish the rest of your backlog? That's all that really matters to them. They don't really care how you do it in a large organization. They want to know, like from the top level, are you going to execute and actually get our users satisfied, right? So from a technical perspective, I may have people underneath that are thinking like, we don't really know this technology that well. We're going to need to get training. How do we really move? And it's kind of like this endless cycle. So one of the things that you really have to focus on is learn what wrong incentives are in place in the organization. Be ready to challenge with new and positive incentives, because you're not going to win every argument. There's no way that I can just make a list of like 1,000 things that my 10-year-old software does and get a one-to-one match. That's not change, right? Like maybe I need to be thinking about like what metrics are actually important, like what we were talking about earlier, use, read. These things that aren't even like, it's in a totally different ecosystem of what we were using from a traditional like monitoring perspective. So by finding the incentives that are there, you can actually take the exact same place that those incentives are coming from and give them something different. So what we did is looked at some positive incentives for the same group of people with a minor change on the new vendor guy. So the team. So this became an incentive for our team. You know, when we introduced these kind of changes and we're in our early planning stages, we were talking about, you know, what is the open source industry doing? What are real technology companies out there doing? Amgen is a biotechnology company, not a software company. So it became very apparent that it would be best to just look out there and what are people doing actually, not just, you know, oh, what are the advertisements of the best APM vendors of the year, right? It becomes a career path for people. You know, do they really want to be stuck using the same technology as a system engineer that likes to be on call if they're in monitoring? What about like SRE? SRE traditionally has some development background. Do we hire developers? Well, then that gets scary because I don't want to lose my job, right? It's not really about that. It's about bringing people into guidance to say, hey, there's going to be value in the employees that we have, and we're going to need to change the team up a little bit, though, and add additional development if we're going to do some real change. And so it becomes a chance to welcome the new members that can then integrate and help them execute and automate on some of these things that are holding them back. So from budget side, basically, you know, we looked at what was in the market, and we should be getting year-over-year OpEx savings. So finance people, how many of you are responsible for a budget? Anybody here? Oh, that's a handful. So as you're thinking about budgets, right, like you generally have to look at CapEx, capital expenses, and OpEx, and there's some accounting principles that go along with SaaS companies, but in general, like you should have pretty good guidance of like what you're getting and what you're paying for it, and make sure that it is comparable with your peers. You have a whole year left, so the time is now saying, you know, if you don't renew, you can spend some of the savings. It went from like the challenge to say, oh, you better renew by next year, otherwise you're not going to get there, to hey, you know, we can actually spend some of these savings on new features because we're going to save so much if we move away. And the new vendor guy says, you know, we're here with real support when you need it beyond the open source community. Our licenses are open source too. Theme of the day, this idea of open SaaS, whether it's, you know, not all open source software is going to become a SaaS company, and there's some really good projects out there that have commercial support without being a SaaS company, OpenNMS being one of them. But I think that it's really important to align yourself with vendors that are partners, right? So to speak really quickly about our former vendor guy, with as much as respect as I can say, I think it's really important to make sure that when you think about like the vendors that you choose and the partnerships that you make with people, they have to be mutually beneficial at best, right? Like the vendor has to benefit from you as a client receive something in exchange, and over time, do you, as a leader in your team, whether you're an individual contributor or you're a management level, it's really about making sure that of the tools that you're using, are you really tracking KPIs to say, this is still the right platform? Because you made the choice at one point in time, but what changes? Everything changes, right? Like there was no Prometheus more than X number of years ago, right? Maybe not everyone was on Kubernetes at one time. Everyone was on Docker Swarm for a little bit and then moved to Kubernetes, right? And then you had like technology changes, what are the offerings that you're getting, and then how do you track it, right? Like what are you objectively measuring against to make sure that you stay with the right open source project, vendor, if that's the case that you need a commercial tool, there's some really great commercial tools out there still that are not open source for certain things. So it's not really about saying, oh, you're only going to be open source, or you're only going to do commercial, or only do a mix. Getting away from the idea that you have to choose build or buy and it's one or the other, I think is really important when you're choosing which projects to use in your environment. So again, recap a little bit about incentives for change. Biggest incentive was to be able to attract talented engineers. I would think majority of you would probably agree that there is a shortage of technical talent, especially in operations space that have had that experience beyond just development and beyond just traditional environment. So you want to be able to give your team like a career path again. This is like, how do you attract people to exciting projects if you're still using something that was in the past? So whether or not you're doing the same kind of change that we were doing, you will go through changes as leaders, and that is really important thing to be able to keep a pulse on, because your best people can still go, right? Like the length of time people working at companies is getting shorter over time, and I don't necessarily see that changing. But with the right mentality, management has a really strong function there, I think, in attracting the right people and giving them something to work on, because enterprises, be that as it may, are large enough that they have the resources to put behind really interesting problems. The high velocity delivery, like we want to deliver this as fast as you would if you were to sign up on a website and get like data into Grafana Cloud really quickly. So as a self-service portal, like we're trying to move towards this idea that, hey, if we change, we can deliver dashboards to you quicker, we can deliver your alerts faster, all these things. And then the opportunity costs of not changing is an incentive to change. If you count up and add up all the opportunity costs around like the potential that you're going to lose employees, the potential that you're going to get behind on how to properly monitor things, the potential that you have like an incident where it actually affects your core business, like the delivery of manufactured biologic drugs, that's really bad. Like those are opportunity costs. And that goes to the fourth point of like, your company North Star is kind of just this idea that you have to keep your company mission in mind, even at the technical engineer level. Because for Amgen, it's about serving patients, right? This is not like, oh, I really like this monitoring tool, so that's why we're going to do it. No, I have an opportunity here to actually save money for the company. I have an opportunity to deliver faster to the scientists that are using their application and needing reliability on those applications, and it becomes now a different value proposition. So we were trying to take the tears of sadness, turn them into something a little bit more cheerful, and that was kind of just a symbol of us saying we're going to start rating ourselves and really get into this idea of service model so that we can get good feedback on what people are doing. So let's talk a little bit about what changes we did make. So positive changes. We had some new requirements for what we were going to do. I'm going to introduce Kava to you today of a part of a solution that we came up with. And I talk about a Kava reference implementation and the Kafka queue and Nginx and where that fits in. And then some benefits achieved and why it matters to you. So you talk about new requirements, just really quickly, like we wanted to make sure we could handle all the push-pull, like capture of metrics, logs, traces, events, centralized around a few core tools, not like tool fatigue, but just a few good ones. But we know we wanted like one interface to visualize the data. And there's always been like different ways to get data into different tools, depending on how you want to do it. But we wanted to be able to be modular if possible, so that we could then take advantage of built-in APIs. We needed to be low cost, preferably open source with a support model, something that we could still rely on and not feel that, hey, moving to open source is kind of scary for an organization that's traditionally purchasing capabilities, right? Enterprises are all about purchasing a capability. In the end, if I'm purchasing a capability for monitoring, I need that to be a really good return on my investment. We felt it was possible that we could do a better investment with open source in general. Needed to be extensible. We wanted to build on top of the platform. Programmatic, the minimal observer effect, which for all of you knowing the observer effect, we don't want to impact what we're monitoring. And it needed to have the organizational context, which goes back to CMDB, which is a really big thing for large companies. We were using ServiceNow. I don't know if anyone else is using them, but ServiceNow is kind of like a large SaaS CMDB company that's kind of up and coming. And we really wanted to be able to get data in that context. It's kind of the metadata. Like, if you go to, there's a really great Grafana site, if you haven't been there yet. Wikimedia has a really great Grafana site, and they do a really good job of like putting the organization of all their applications into like a single like set of tons of dashboards. I don't know how many they have now, like over 50 or 100. And we wanted to have that so that people that went in to like make a ticket in ServiceNow against application X could just go to Grafana and say, or whatever our visualization tool was, we eventually went with Grafana, we'll get there, like application X, and then see everything about it, because that's how we tagged the data, and that's how we tagged the data in the time series, how we tagged the logs. It's also how we tagged the dashboards in Grafana. And it needed to excite the team technically and delight our customers. So we wanted to be able to improve the customer satisfaction. But we have our old friends back, and they brought a lot of their friends. Many monitoring software companies all agree they can do the job and save the hassle of open source. Open source is such a hassle. Like, what are you going to do when the project gets abandoned? What are you going to do when upgrades don't go as planned? Like, who are you going to call, right? And it becomes one of those things where like I get it from a perspective that as an enterprise I have to make decisions that are going to impact hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So if I am making a technical choice in my own little service here that happens to be global, but it's still my own little service compared to like the compute service, application teams, they're all going to rely on my service. It's like I need to make sure that this is actually going to work, right? And there's a lot of people that are going to come to you if you're trying to make this kind of change in an organization that are going to be kind of naysayers, because you know what? It's SaaS, it's cloud, just use what's on Amazon, use what we have, and you'll be fine, right? And then, here's my wallet, and you can have my Amex card too, right? So, and you can go back under contract again. And it becomes like a vicious cycle. So we came up with something different. So I'll introduce Kava to you for the first time. I wanted to present it here at GrafanaCon and not at like a traditional monitoring seminar because I think you guys are my people. I like Grafana. I like what it does. And I think that you'll kind of get the idea of what we came up with to talk about monitoring at Amgen. So Kava is a concept of a framework. It stands for collect, aggregate, visualize, and alert. And what happened was we decided to go through the exercise of going through and checking all the other tools that we wanted to compare. The collect, the aggregate, which we'll talk about definition of aggregate in a second here, visualize, and alert became the 4 boiled down functions of literally every monitoring tool ever. So if you start to think about it, like, how many of you have used cacti in the past? Yay, cacti, Nagios, right? It's still there. Isinga. They all do something, right? They either collect it, push, pull, that's fine. They put it somewhere, so I'm using the term aggregate in the sense that it's collecting the data, that it's there, whether that's ingestion layers, queues, where the data sits at rest, that's the entire aggregate, not talking about like roll-ups and things like that. And then it has some kind of visualization, probably, good or bad, and then it has an ability to alert. So when we thought about this, like, okay, so let's talk about collection really quickly. If we stop talking in terms of tools, because like, oh yeah, I use Datadog, like, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. Are you using it for collecting data? Okay, great. Are you going to alert on it? Okay, great. And when it comes to open source tools, it started to me back like when CollectD was first released and then Graphite later. This idea of modularity within monitoring tools kind of came about, that you could have a different piece of software feed data to the second layer here. It became natural for us to start thinking in terms of these 4 functions. So collection includes the data capture, agents, synthetics, logs, flows, all the data. Our section on aggregate is the pipeline. So we're using Kafka as a queue, and the data eventually gets put into rest at a time series database, a log database. All the events are there. If we have a SaaS vendor that we use, like they're probably being used at the aggregate level. The single portal design with multiple data sources is definitely something we wanted, and Grafana really fits that well. And then thresholds, actions, notifications, escalations is kind of like the 4th function. So if you've ever had to sit and set all these 4 functions up in every tool, imagine doing that for like 18 tools. Like, I don't really have time to program that part. So what we came up with is the Kava API. So Kava API is something that we're going to actually be open sourcing eventually later this year, hopefully. It's our API to capture these things, and there's a lot of use cases we could go into for what it does, but I want to be able to offer to my internal clients different tools. Like, they don't have to know that, like, say I take Telegraph. Telegraph I really like to use for the collection bucket, but that's not really important. It's the function. I may not use it for its other purposes that are out there from like a particular project, but I want to use the best in class, and Kava API kind of helps us do that. So, now it's like our attitude is that we're no longer tool and product focused, but we have a language to describe what we're doing in monitoring and an API platform for dependent services to call. So dependent services that have no idea about monitoring, what they can do now is, we'll look at our reference framework here. We have all these tools that are coming into collection, aggregation, visualization, and alerting. So generally, we're focusing on Telegraph from the API perspective, but we still have things like StatsD. We even have AppDynamics and Splunk still, since we had some perpetual licenses around that. Aggregation, we're sending everything to our Kafka queue as much as possible, and we're moving towards wanting everything to go there for several reasons. One, it makes easier testing when you want to bring new consumers and new databases to test data. Visualization, we're working pretty much on Grafana exclusively right now. The other tools may have that visualization function, but I'm not programming on it. I want to focus and say, here's where you go, because now it's not about like a single dashboard that all these tools provide at a really high cost. It's a low-cost way to get as many data sources as I want. And we're doing some things with OpenNMS and Capacitor on that. So quickly, data flow for an initial use case. User or the build process calls an API for the auth token, the Kava API, then, let's go back real quick. They build a post like add server Jordan to monitoring with some parameters to the API. The API will then gather those key data service points inside of our ServiceNow catalog, so I know all the things that belong to that server. The API then builds a Telegraph config with the ServiceNow tags inside of it so that we get that metadata at the time series level. And then we're storing that back into our Galera cluster, which is actually the same cluster we use for Grafana. And then that API will then call out to Ansible to deliver a newly built config and agent. And then the API returns a nice URL back to the user. So it's already created the Grafana dashboard. So it's a really nice way of like giving the users like a one action thing. They get something back with all their metadata there. And now that I have their configuration, I don't have to like worry about what they do in the future to their configuration of Telegraph. I can just reinforce it because I already have a database of it in Galera, right? We'll try to go a little bit faster here so we can get through everything. I wanted to just really quickly talk about one aspect of what we're doing in Kava. Our implementation of it is this idea that we have the Kafka queue, we collect data, we send it to Kafka, we have different consumers from Kafka, and we send it to multiple InfluxDB databases for time series. This is one use case. And we're able to do that, and that helps us scale wide, which is something that was mentioned earlier. And it's been useful for us at this point. For retrieving data, we use Nginx in front of Grafana and then Nginx after Grafana in order to cache queries from InfluxDB, like as necessary. So this is all running in AWS on containers. Pretty much, there's a few things we do bare metal with, like at Kafka. And I like to call this like a really poor man's caching layer, because if you've ever done a lot of TTL work with Nginx, like you can relieve a lot of stress from Influx by caching the right things with Nginx. So the question of the hour is like, why does this matter to you again? Like, what were the benefits? When bringing this kind of change, you got to keep awareness around like the positive benefits and keep that very high and socializing these results as you go through the change. Big organizations are like a battleship. It takes a long time to steer. And so you really have to call out ahead where you're going. And that was a challenge we had. We were able to introduce the software development lifecycle to a team that was traditionally just engineers. We saved a lot of money, like 90% OpEx. And we reduced all the manual processes. It gave us a way to stop talking about tools. Like I don't talk about I have 18 tools now or 15 tools or 5 tools. I have a function and I have a visualization layer. And I worry about how do I manage, collection, aggregate, visualize, and alert. We deliver a platform that's modular so that we can include machine learning later on with Spark, which is at the Kafka layer. And we focus now on like enforcing those good monitoring performance habits like use, red, golden signals, all the interesting things that we could go in and talk about for a long time. So we're able to enforce SLAs that way. And I'm going to skip forward on a couple of things. We are going to hopefully open source this later this year to kind of give a better feedback loop. So people who want to use it, you'll be able to do that. Few other benefits. It gives a voice to the community. We want to continue the API development ourselves in order to add things around alerting, delivering new plugins, not just Telegraph and other agents. We want to be able to use our API to manage the topic creation in Kafka for applications that are now in the business saying, hey, we want to use your Kafka as a service, not just with monitoring data. So this has really had a lot of benefits from like an organizational perspective. And then stream to Spark for time series, machine learning, model analysis. We think there's some value there that we can experiment with. And a lot of this about like the business data use of this stuff is really important because I think that, in the end, like something I learned in e-commerce really early on, you have to be able to like correlate this back to your business and what you're doing. And it's really easy to think of like traditional e-commerce. You buy something, if the page is slow, they're not going to buy it, they're just going to leave your site. And there's a lot of really clean like paths that you can follow. But I think every business has this, and you have to have a platform to be able to get to that level. And I wanted to leave you with a quick thought of DevOps culture from the 19th century by an American called Ralph Waldo Emerson. Said, do not be too timid and squeamish about your actions. All life is an experiment. The more experiments you make, the better. What if they are a little coarse and you may get your coat soiled or torn? What if you do fail and get fairly rolled in the dirt once or twice? Up again, you shall never be so afraid of a tumble. And so don't be afraid to experiment when you're doing this at a large enterprise scale. There's ways to correct course when you're doing it. And I really think that you'll see a lot of benefits from it. The community benefits from it. The open SaaS companies benefit from it when you're willing to take a risk on them. And it's proven really valuable for us. So thanks again. I think we're out of time. But if you're interested in joining, Amgen is hiring. So please send me an email. And thank you for your attention.